This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is a senior lecturer in international relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's the author of a new book entitled The Six-Day War, The Breaking of the Middle East, that was recently published upon the war's 50th anniversary by Yale University Press. Dr. Guy Laron, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, good morning.
So let me start by asking you this. Your approach to the subject matter is different from the one undertaken by other historians who have studied the Six-Day War in two ways, if I understand it correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. One, insofar as you place a greater emphasis on political economy than other researchers have in the context of the war. And the other is that you look beyond the internal dynamic of the Arab-Israeli conflict and analyze the war from a regional, international, and more importantly, a Cold War perspective. Now, is this right? And also, can you tell us how your historiography of the Six-Day War differs from previous historiographies?
Well, I think I'll start with the second question, and it is that I think the most famous book, the most read book nowadays about the Six-Day War is Michael Oren's 6 Days of War. And, you know, other than the fact that I criticize him at several points, those two books complement each other. My book is the prequel to Oren's book because his book focuses on the war and, you know, action-packed days in which everything happened, not just on the battlefield, but also in the corridors of the UN and in the White House and in the Kremlin, etc. While my book is devoted more or less to the decade that preceded the war, all the things that happened before the war, because, you know, what I think is what happens before the war is very decisive. It doesn't just lead to the war, it predetermines how the war would be conducted. So this is the way in which my book differs from Oren's, that, you know, it focuses on what happened before the war and less on the war itself. And when I got to the last chapter and basically summarized the war in 15 pages, I thought, this is okay. You know, it lasted just 6 days. You know, how much space do you need for a war that lasted that long?
I have to tell you that reading your book, I couldn't help but think of the Guns of August. You know, there's all this sort of preliminary political buildup, the international powers, the alignment of forces. Can you give our listeners a sense of what those alignments were? How were the international powers lining up around the countries in the region that set the stage?
So the story I'm trying to tell in the introduction and also less so in the chapters, it was a very sad time in terms of hopes for third world development. In the two preceding decades, it was, leaders around the world thought it would be very easy to develop third world countries. All you need to do is inject some capital, some know-how, some technology, and you will jumpstart industrialization that easy. And, if it looks far-fetched to you, think about how people imagined the future of Japan until a decade or two ago, or how they imagined the future of China until 3 years ago. So it was the same thing. You would look at library shelves of books from the 50s and the 60s. You see Uganda in transition, Tanzania in transition. All the countries around the world were in transition towards, of course, modernity. By the mid-60s, people started realizing that it won't be that easy. Both the leaders of developing countries and the leaders of developed countries. So that's the background. What does it mean in concrete terms for the Middle East is that Arab countries, and most importantly Egypt, they stop getting aid money. So the economic situation deteriorates. And when that happens, politics are volatile. One thing you can do as a leader in Syria or in Egypt is look for external adventures. And something very similar happens in Israel as well.
Did it happen in other places in the developing world at the time? Because this tagline of this book will be decolonization and its discontents, right?
Exactly.
It's the lull after this, promising stage in the 1940s and 50s, as you say.
Or like the Middle East is paying for the newfound failures of decolonization in Africa. Is that what you're implying?
Absolutely. So yeah, I guess it undermines the myth of decolonization, that the European powers left and everything was hunky-dory after that. To like the best thing that ever happened. There's no new colonialism after then, the 40s and the early 50s, etc. But
do you see similar processes in other decolonized parts of the world?
Latin America is experiencing military coups. Something similar happens in Indonesia. I didn't emphasize it enough because I burdened my readers with enough political economy for one book. But one thing that you can see passing as a thread throughout the chapters, in each economic crisis, or to be more specific, balance of payment crisis in Israel, Syria, and Egypt, the World Bank is involved. They preach the same remedy: cut the budget, lower
we
the
never
deficit.
heard that before.
Yeah. And countries do that.
Because it worked so well.
Yeah. But then you can say there was some naivety at the time about what would be the results of that prescription. But Israel followed the advice of the World Bank, Damascus did, Cairo did, and the results were awful.
So what's really interesting here is that those regional hostilities around the world aren't really derivative of the Cold War heightening, but actually organic processes in and of themselves that in a way complement the Cold War dynamic.
Well, it's a fusion. You see, so what happens in the region is that when, civilian leaders are discredited because people like Ashkal and Nasser and, the leadership of the Syrian Ba'ath Party, they build a reputation about being stewards of the economy. But if the economy is not working well, then who are they and what are they worth? So generals are strengthening in terms of their political influence. And what generals usually do is create conflicts. They see the world in black and white, in binary terms. There's no win-win situations. Only one side wins, the other losing. And then you have the superpowers. So as long as the superpowers were injecting money into those, what you can call by this stage, failed states, they were, muddling through. But when they stop doing that, then you can see some, major volatility.
Well, there are a number of issues that come up here. One is this relationship between the military level and the civilian level. I mean, you're arguing that the generals are always more confrontational and tend towards advocating the use of force. And at the same time, we don't always see that today. Sometimes, certainly in Israel, we see sometimes the generals are even more restrained than the politicians. Is that always the case, that the generals are always advocating more force?
Well, I'm relying on a certain political science theory that says, yes, usually generals...
I'm glad there's a theory.
Yeah, there is a theory that there's certain theories I rely on. Jack Snyder from Columbia University, whose work influenced me greatly. But I guess you could say that things are somewhat different today. There are different elites. The civilian elite and the military elite, they come from different backgrounds. And until things will align, we're thinking about Israel, right?
Mostly.
Specifically. And until there'll be uniformity of opinion between the military elite and the civilian elite, then maybe, yes, this will be the case.
Going back to the 1960s, if Nasser's promise of economic prosperity was discredited, why was he more reserved than his generals? I mean, it should be the other way around, right?
Well, two things. Nasser was very realistic about the Arab-Israeli conflict from the moment he reached power in 1952. And it's amazing how when you get closer to the war, you get more and more pronouncements of him, both in public speeches and private conversations, saying, the Palestine problem, the Palestine issue, this is not a problem we can solve in the foreseeable future. This is a problem that might solve itself in 100 years' time. So he was not going to fight Israel, and he would readily admit, which was kind of brave of him, that militarily speaking, the Arab armies were no match to Israel's superiority. So he has, a long-term background as someone who is dovish, relatively speaking, towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. What about his general, his most important general, Abdul Hakim Amir? I think his perspective was they have a really nasty conflict. Each of them is thinking when the other would try, to defenestrate me and push me.
Personal conflict between them, you mean? Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was basically Nasser and the ruling party, the Arab Socialist Union, against the army. So much so that there was Arab Socialist Union youth. So when they were doing summer camps, one of their activities was coup rehearsal. So they were rehearsing to the time in which the army would launch a coup, and then they would rally the public to support the president. That happens on the penultimate day of the war. On 9th of June, Nasser resigns. It's sort of, he just despaired and he took personal responsibility. And then the ASU, the Arab Socialist Union, starts, pushing the button and making the machine work. So that gives you a sense of how tense the political situation in Egypt was at the time. And Amr is thinking back in 66 and 67, of course, that if he can show that the army can strengthen Egypt's role, Egypt's leadership in the Arab world, Nasser would not dare to depose him. Okay? He doesn't think of himself as someone who can be number one, but he wants to entrench his position as number two. And since the economic situation in Egypt deteriorates and the Muslim Brotherhood in 1965, they start thinking about blowing up public buildings and killing Nasser and other senior leaders in the Egyptian regime, Nasser really needs the army. He needs it as an internal repression force.
So he jumped on the bandwagon, as it were, and, this spiral of rhetoric just went out of hand?
Yeah, I mean, one way to see it is that Nasser was maneuvered into a position in which he found himself in a corner, and then, he had no choice but to confront Israel. Think about what happens on the 13th of May. So Egyptian troops started rolling into Sinai. And then the thinking was, we're going to spook the Israelis out of the idea that they are going to attack Syria. And we're going to negotiate with the UN. That's what Nasser is thinking. We're going to negotiate with the UN some way out of it. But then the messenger that delivers the letter to the UN forces is an Egyptian officer. He changes the language of the letter to issue an ultimatum for the UN to evacuate all of its forces. And then things really go haywire.
It's like a chain of just misinformation and changed messages. And I want to take us back a little bit because you've talked so much about the internal dynamics in Egypt, but I think also your work is really strong on helping us understand, despite what we said before, the role of the Cold War in helping to shape these dynamics. Or maybe it wasn't quite as much of a fixed Cold War in those 2 years prior to the Six-Day War, but it was building up to that. Tell us something about how the Soviets were playing. What was the role of the Soviets at this point? Because they were very central, but maybe not in the typical way we sometimes think about it.
So I have to tell you something. Various parts of the book I researched, none took so much time and knowing so many languages as the Soviet parts of the book. And those were the parts that got the least attention. And when reviewers actually read them or referred to them, they understood the opposite of what I wanted to say. Because the old story about the Soviet involvement in the Six-Day War is that the Soviet Union wanted a war in the Middle East to erupt in the summer of 1967. They wanted another Middle Eastern Vietnam in which the U.S. would, sap its power in another regional war. And all the archival evidence that I have unearthed tells a different story. And I found it in Prague and in Berlin and some documents in Moscow as well. Basically, the Soviets were not interested in a war starting in the Middle East. They were looking very suspiciously at the actions of their Syrian ally. They resented Fatah guerrilla campaign against Israel. And what's kind of funny in retrospect that they saw it through Soviet land. So the Fatah were basically like the Viet Cong in Vietnam, and they were supported by the Chinese, that they were the arch enemies of the Soviet Union at the time, competing with them for influence in the third world. So they tried clumsily, but they tried nevertheless to create a regional system in which Syrian radicalism and Palestinian guerrilla activity would be contained by Egypt. Basically, they asked the Egyptians to restrain the Syrians and restrain the Palestinians. And then there's the specific story of what happens on the 13th of May. That's the turning point. Because on the 13th of May, the KGB delivered a memo to the Egyptian government in which it was said that Israel would attack Syria in the second half of May.
And actually that they had troops building up.
No.
No, not yet. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay.
Because
we got the play-by-play. This is so exciting.
Don't get ahead of yourself.
No.
Well, the thing is, I've researched it in such depth that I basically recreated what happened in those 48 hours after that missive is received by the Egyptians. Because what I think happened was the Soviets fell prey to two disinformation campaigns. One ran by Israel, the other by Syria, both independent of each other and both serving, ulterior goals. Israel basically wanted to spook the Syrians. I think it was the personal order of Eshkol as kind of a last resort to prevent Israel generals that really wanted to fight Syria. They were itching for it for 2 years. So Eshkol is basically saying the Shin Bet, internal security, leaked to the KGB that, the Syrians should behave or else. And then maybe the Syrians would be so frightened that they will curtail Fatah activity permanently, decisively.
So Eshkol's trying to de-escalate his own generals, so he leaks some information that actually ends up escalating.
Yeah, he was unfortunate in so many respects in this crisis, and this is just one of them. Now, the Syrians, once they understand that there's this rumor about Israel attacking them, they lap over it because the Ba'ath regime at that specific date is having its worst political crisis yet. The Muslim Brotherhood are in the streets against the regime because at the end of April there was a blasphemous article.
An atheist article.
Yes. All Islam has ever given to the Arab world should be saved as a mummy in the Museum of History, something along these lines. So the Syrians said, yes, it's not only that Israel is about to attack us, we already see 11 brigades gathering on our border. There weren't 11 brigades in the whole Israeli army at the time. But this counts a lot for the Egyptians. So what they know is that they got this report from Moscow. When they phone the Syrians, not only corroborate that, but add on that. And now it seems pretty certain that they have to do something. When Nasser takes the decision to act, he knows that the Egyptian army needs at least 72 hours to redeploy in Sinai. So if he wants to prevent the war from happening, he needs to do something now on the 13th of April, because on the 17th, Israel might attack. And then it would be too late. Then he will have to fight.
Okay, one exception to this saga, this epic of miscalculation and spin, is another party to the war, which is Jordan, that didn't really have all this that you're describing here. It wasn't really about trying to divert some sort of internal crisis. It wasn't really, miscalculation. Basically, Jordan just found itself somehow fighting this war. How did it happen?
Well, in some ways, Jordan is similar to the other countries. Of course, it's a developing country. And the problem in Jordan is that resources are allocated based on ethnicity. Okay? So the eastern bank of the Jordan River is getting much more than the western bank. But the majority of the population at the time is Palestinian. And once the Palestinians see that Nasser is entering its troops to Sinai, they're very enthusiastic about that. To add to the problem, for various reasons, King Hussein, did a kind of a shift in how he appointed officers. So up to about 65, those were usually Bedouin officers. From 65 onwards, he thought that Palestinians officers were more qualified, and he took a gamble. Well, too big of a gamble, and started appointing senior Palestinian officers, including his chief of staff. His chief of staff, Hamash, was very influential in this story in pushing towards Jordan fighting with Arab countries, and that when Jordan will fight, its war plans would be coordinated with Egypt. That's the tragedy of Jordan, because it ended the war that it shouldn't have entered into, and it entered it in a way that ensured that Israel would seize the West Bank.
And also, it seems to be counterintuitive or counter to what Eshkol wanted, because he had this sort of warming relationship with Hussein. And actually, you uncover this information that that Eshkol's government was actively helping to lobby for the Jordanians in Washington to stop those budget cuts. So
right.
How did the relationship go astray?
It's even bigger than that, because towards 65, in Eshkol's office, they started to speak about Arab realism. So there are two good Arab leaders, Nasser and Hussein. They're Arab realists. They're willing to have a de facto peace with Israel, although they won't sign an agreement. And the only bad guys are the Syrians, basically. So just think of what happens in the days before the Six-Day War, when Eshkol's government finds itself confronted by a military coalition of the bad Arabs with the good Arabs. So Eshkol definitely didn't want a war with Jordan. There were attempts to deliver messages to Hussein along the lines of, if you don't fight against us, we don't fight against you. And I think the person that was most responsible for Israel taking the West Bank was Dayan. And that's another measure of Eshkol losing control over affairs, because Dayan was his arch enemy. And I'll take this opportunity because it's an episode I didn't got the chance to tell in my book. They hated each other always. And once Dayan becomes Minister of Defense, he took a lot of control from Eshkol. And Eshkol...
Eshkol was coerced into appointing Dayan. That should also be pointed
Absolutely. Out. Eshkol was the master of innocence, because he did a lot of bad things to Dayan as well. Dayan had good reasons to hate Eshkol. So Eshkol would sit in his office and he would say, what did I ever do to him? I even voted him to be born. And that referred to the fact that when Dayan's mother in Dgania was pregnant, the kibbutz was so poor that it was a question whether she should, conceive or not. Can we afford this baby? And Eshkol, being a true Keynesian, believing in the future, he led the yays, basically.
How did you fail to put this into your book? You need to not only put this into a book, you need to make a movie out of it.
Well, Stephen King, the author, he had this advice to kill your darlings. Sometimes you have such a wonderful story and you see that it doesn't work within the context. It distracts the reader. So.
I think you should copyright that story very fast and do something else with it.
I wanted to ask you another question about the Cold War dynamic that was accelerated by the war. I mean, it was a turning point in many ways because, as you said before that, both the Soviet Union and the United States had an ambivalent take on the Israeli-Arab conflict, both in relation to Israel and the Arab countries. And afterwards, it was really clear-cut. The Soviets were, the Arab world was clearly aligned with the Soviet Union. The entire communist bloc severed ties with Israel, and Israel that had pro-American sympathies before, but clearly aligned with America afterwards. What was it about really the war that made that happen?
And before you get into that, I just want to give you a preview that we're going to then talk about how that plays out even to this day. I think we see a lot of the similar dynamics, the neo-Cold War environment.
So what happens after the Six-Day War? I think there was one book about those 6 years between 67 to 73 that calls that period the hot years of the Cold War in the Middle East. And that's very true. What was it about the war that changed the dynamics? I think there was a lot of happiness in Washington at the time that they're wallowing in Vietnam and they can't find an answer to this war, which is both a conventional war and a guerrilla war. Israel seemed to find a special app. And, in various ways, it looked like the most reliable ally that the U.S. has in the Middle East and beyond that even, okay? And a loyal ally. Even before the Six-Day War, there's thinking inside the White House, especially the National Security Advisor, Walt Rustow, that he paints a picture in which the United States is fighting basically radical movements in the Third World. They started already in the 50s. And he calls people like Nasser and Sukarno and Mao pocket Bismarcks. Okay? That's his perspective. And Israel can be one of those regional policemen that will help the United States wipe out those pocket Bismarcks. Walt Rostow tells the Israeli ambassador it's better to have those people removed even if you know that the next leader would be of the same opinion. Even that is valuable. So Israel, didn't kill Nasser, but it cut him to size. And it justified all the hopes that Walt Rostow, that he's basically Lyndon Johnson's Johnson, Walt Rostow, it justified all the hopes that Walt Rostow had in Israel. So the alliance deepens. More weapons would go to Israel from American manufacturers. What Israel would do in the coming years would be also a kind of window shop to the abilities of American weapons. It helped sales, basically. And the Soviet Union would respond in kind. Okay, so if you shore up your ally, we will shore up our ally as well. And the war played out to the hands of the hawks in Washington and Moscow. It was a reaffirmation that the Cold War is real and that you have to back your ally strongly. And this is how the game will play in the coming years. And another thing worth saying even shortly, it was always very much connected to the Vietnam War. So both sides thought that, both in Moscow and in Washington, if we will help our ally hit hard at the other proxy, then the other side would be more flexible in its negotiation positions, not only vis-a-vis the Middle East, but also vis-a-vis Vietnam.
I don't know if we have a direct parallel now because I'm not sure what the Vietnam would be, but can we talk about how these dynamics played out in the future up until today? Because obviously we have what looks like a sort of neo-Cold War proxy dynamic going on in the Middle East, slightly different alignment, right? Jordan and Egypt are no longer part of it. Do you think this is sort of a mirror of what happened back then, or is it something totally different?
Well, I hope not. I hope we're not sliding into a new Cold War because I don't see Washington right now encouraging Israel to kick Russia out of Syria. That is not happening at the moment. And
maybe that's because America's foreign policy is in shambles.
Yeah, you see Washington speaking from both sides of its mouth, basically. So the Congress is being very hawkish towards the Kremlin, and the White House seemingly not so, right? Trump, whatever his other vices, he's trying to find a way to cooperate with Putin. So we still don't have a Cold War in the Middle East right now. We do have Russia back.
And we do have an alignment. We do have an alignment of countries with America, the American, Saudi, something sort of alliance there in the Gulf states, and Russia backing, Iran and Syria. And
yeah, I won't say that it's a conflict. Maybe you can see the two superpowers confronting over the fate of Iran if things would come to that. Hopefully not. The world has enough trouble as it is. The tension between the two superpowers that pushed their proxies towards a confrontation, I don't see it yet. And another thing worth saying about what Putin is doing in Syria is when you compare the level of intervention, of Soviet intervention in the Middle East back then, and you see what Putin is doing now, it's like he's playing the same cards, but with a much weaker hand. What is he trying to defend? One base in Tartus. So at that time, after the Six-Day War, they had military forces, the Soviet Union, both in Syria and Egypt and Algeria and Iraq and Yemen. That's not the case today. They have only Syria. And Iran is not really an ally. It's a friendly power.
Well, there's something to look forward to, isn't there? Right?
No, it's very interesting because in some parts of your book, it looks like you're trying to show us that the superpowers make their plans and the proxies just laugh because they don't always do what the superpowers think that they were going to do.
Yeah, the tyranny of the weak. So that the dynamic, you can see it happening then and now, but it would be wrong to say that the superpowers don't influence things. They do. By action, if you look at the prolonged civil war in Syria, also by inaction.
All right. Dr. Guy Laron, the author of the new book, The 6-Day War, The Breaking of the Middle East. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
And a big thanks to Gizem Özdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. We have more than 300 interviews to keep you busy, and we think you should listen to every single one of them. Like us on Facebook, follow us both on Twitter. Our Facebook page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.